In a quiet little town where roofs were drowning in ivy and time flowed slowly, like honey from a silver spoon, lived a young archivist named Elara. Her days were spent among fragile parchment and faded ink. She healed old books, carefully splicing torn pages, bringing back the shine to the dulled gold on the spines. To Elara, the smell of century-old dust and dry leather bindings was sweeter than any perfume, for it held the promise of untold stories. One morning, among the usual mail, she found a thick ivory envelope, sealed with a heavy wax stamp bearing the impression of a rose. The letter invited her to the ancient Rosenwald Castle to restore a massive library that had not been touched for hundreds of years. Elara's heart skipped a beat with anticipation. She agreed without a moment's hesitation. The carriage swayed on the washed-out road, and the rhythmic clatter of wheels through puddles lulled Elara like a lullaby. The autumn rain lashed against the roof of the carriage as the massive shape of Rosenwald Castle slowly emerged from the twilight. A dark mountain of stone, overgrown with ivy, its towers reaching into the low clouds. The heavy oak door opened, and Elara stepped inside. The contrast was instant and blissful. The cold remained beyond the threshold, while she was enveloped by a deep, velvety warmth that smelled of beeswax and pine firewood. Fire crackled in the massive fireplaces, casting rusty reflections on the stone walls. Countless corridors faded into soft twilight. Portraits of former masters looked down sternly from the walls, and antique knightly armor gleamed dimly in the niches. The castle was not frightening. It enveloped her, like a giant slumbering colossus, carefully sheltering its guest from the bad weather in its warm stone palms. Elara smiled and sighed quietly. It was good here. From the depths of the dimly lit hall, a young man stepped toward her. Hugo, the keeper of the castle and all its clockwork mechanisms, moved so silently, as if he were afraid to startle the age-old dreams slumbering in the tapestries of Rosenwald. A heavy bunch of bronze keys hung at his belt, and a thin watchmaker's screwdriver glinted in his breast pocket. He stopped a few steps away and greeted Elara with a slightly old-fashioned, respectful bow. His voice turned out to be quiet and measured, like the swing of a pendulum in the silence of the night. Not a single unnecessary word, not a single hasty gesture. It seemed as if he had grown out of these very walls, that stone and time had polished him just like the steps of the grand staircase. Hugo led her down the corridor to her assigned room, and Elara caught herself feeling something strange. She trusted him as if she had known him for a long time. Left alone, Elara put out the lamp and listened. The castle was not silent. It was alive. Something creaked in the floorboards. Something sighed behind the stonework, and the rain outside beat a rhythm that resembled the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. The drafts wandering the corridors brought more than just cold. In their breath, a quiet, almost meaningful whisper could be heard, as if the ancient walls were retelling forgotten legends to each other. and the shadows from the dying candles in the candelabras danced on their own, forming now the silhouette of a deer, now the outline of a winged horse from old legends. Elara pulled the blanket up to her chin and smiled. Every nook of this place held a secret that desperately wanted to be solved. Falling asleep under the heavy canopy, she felt the castle breathing with her, carefully preserving the dreams of long-gone eras in its stone lungs. The morning sun, cutting through the centuries-old gloom of the corridors, turned every speck of dust into a tiny golden fairy. In the light of day, Rosenwald turned out to be completely different. Not a slumbering giant, but a welcoming, slightly absent-minded old man who had thrown open the doors of his storerooms. Hugo led Elara from hall to hall, and the scale revealed itself gradually, like an unrolling scroll. Endless rows of oak cabinets, locked wrought iron chests with tomes, stacks of parchment scrolls tied with rotted ribbons. Dust lay on everything like a silvery moss. Elara stopped, pressed her palm against a cracked spine, and laughed quietly out of happiness. For her, this centuries-old dust was golden pollen. Hugo, usually sparse with words, noticed her shining eyes and softened a bit. For the first time in a long while, he spoke willingly, telling her about how the castle was built and who had collected these books. They turned into the main hall, and Elara looked up. The grand staircase, a wide flight of snow-white marble with railings adorned with stone roses, rose upward with proud, royal grace. Flight after flight, past the second floor, higher, even higher, and suddenly it broke off. It did not hit a wall. It did not end with a landing. It simply stopped with a smooth, flawless cut, as if chopped off by an invisible sword. The last step stepped right into the emptiness of a massive air shaft. Elara blinked, expecting the illusion to dissipate. It did not dissipate. She looked around. Two more staircases leading to the North Tower broke off into nothingness in exactly the same way. No debris, no signs of destruction. The stone on the cuts was polished, as if the architect had originally planned these impossible routes from nowhere to nowhere. Elara slowly turned to Hugo. He stood calmly, as if long accustomed to the fact that in Rosenwald, the staircases lead into the sky. Hugo met her astonished gaze and sighed softly, as if deciding to crack open a door he would have preferred to leave locked. "This is not a builder's mistake," he said more quietly. "The upper floors and towers are closed. Ancient magic, older than any of us. No one has set foot there for 300 years. He leaned against the railing and began to speak the way people speak of things memorized since childhood. The castle was built by the first architect, a master who put not only lime into the mortar, but also dreams, prophecies, and living illusions. One day he disappeared, and he severed the staircases intentionally so that not a single soul would enter his innermost chambers until the time was right. The steps are not ruins," Hugo added casually, as if talking about a broken lock on a door. They are a barrier, a lock, the key to which has been lost in the ages. Elara took a breath. The explanation did not reassure her. It only multiplied her questions. Hugo expected fright. He expected a request to stay away from the severed flights. But Elara remained silent, looking up at the last step that had stepped into the emptiness. And in her eyes burned not fear, but the investigative fire with which she leaned over deciphered manuscripts. Where others saw a frightening abyss, her inquiring mind saw only a riddle waiting for the right answer. The unsolved mystery of the castle was a book with its last pages torn out. Not a curse, but a challenge. Then we must find a way to finish building these steps, she said firmly. I came to restore the library, but it seems the castle itself requires restoration. Hugo blinked. He had lived here for so many years, resigned to the emptiness above the marble cuts. No one had ever said, "we must," before. Something warm stirred in his chest, a forgotten, unfamiliar feeling. Hope. The days flowed steadily, like sand in an antique hourglass. Every morning, Elara went down to the main archive, a spacious hall with high vaults where hundreds of half-rotted tomes slumbered in oak cabinets. She carefully smoothed out stuck pages, rewrote faded catalogs, and wiped century-old dust from leather spines. Her hands habitually glided over the fragile parchment, bringing forgotten words back to life. But her mind wandered far away, along the invisible steps leading into the void. The answer had to be here, among these papers. Castle plans, blueprints, the first architect's notes. Something must have surely survived. And Elara began to search, methodically, scroll after scroll, tome after tome, fishing out any mention of the upper tiers. The old papers became her clues, and the archive became the site of a quiet, persistent investigation. The solution came not from the scrolls, but from the walls. Passing by the portrait gallery, Elara stopped. On the canvases, ancient countesses and knights held books and scrolls covered in strange symbols. The same signs repeated from painting to painting, like a secret cipher passed down through generations. Elara sketched each symbol and laid out the drafts on the floor of the archive. Then she compared them with the layout of the castle, with the geometry of the halls, the turns of the corridors, the placement of the severed staircases. And then the pattern emerged. Rosenwald was built not according to the laws of architecture, but according to the laws of versification. The corridors wound like stanzas of an epic. The halls opened up like refrains, and the staircases rhymed floor with floor. The steps broke off exactly where the poem remained unfinished, where the line was roughly cut off mid-word. The castle was not a building. It was a text. When Elara laid out her sketches and blueprints in front of Hugo, he remained silent for a long time, frowning. A man of gears and springs, He was used to trusting what could be touched, taken apart, and oiled. The poetry of stone seemed like an invention to him. But Elara spoke with such conviction, and her conclusions lined up so neatly that Hugo's skepticism faltered. He poked a calloused finger at one of the symbols and quietly said, "I actually saw this sign on a hidden panel in the east wing." From that evening on, they became true partners. Where her inquiring mind soared among metaphors and ciphers, his skilled hands found hidden levers and locking mechanisms. Every evening, they leaned over the old plans by the fireplace, exchanging guesses, and the silence between them was as meaningful as words. Their quiet partnership imperceptibly strengthened into true friendship. In the armory, among swords and shields, stood the ceremonial armor of the first architect. Steel darkened by time, covered with fine engraving. Hugo nodded at it. "The visor is jammed completely shut. No matter how much I've tried, it won't yield." Elara stepped closer and ran her finger across the breastplate. What seemed like a floral ornament, upon closer inspection, formed into lines. Letters hid in the curls of the leaves like snakes in the grass. She read aloud, slowly, in a sing-song voice. "Where the word ends, there the path begins. In the shadow of the tapestry, where history is silent, seek the hidden heart." On the last syllable, something clicked inside the armor. Hugo flinched, pulled the visor, and the old steel, which had kept its silence for centuries, gave way. Not to brute force, but to the right word. Behind the raised visor, a tiny bronze key gleamed dimly. They exchanged glances. The verses pointed the way. A secret door was hidden behind a tapestry where history was silent. All that remained was to find the right tapestry. The castle fell asleep. Elara and Hugo slipped out of the library with a single oil lantern. The flame behind the glass trembled, and the shadows darted on the walls like trapped birds. Floorboards creaked under every step, and both involuntarily held their breath as if afraid to wake the sleeping giant. The furthest corridor met them with the smell of untouched dust. Here, from floor to ceiling, hung a massive tapestry. Knights on rearing horses fought winged chimeras. Hugo lifted the heavy edge of the fabric, and Elara brought the lantern to the exposed masonry. His fingers glided over the stone, feeling for a seam. A quiet click. The stone slab moved aside silently, revealing a narrow passage from which a draught of cold and mystery emerged. They exchanged glances and stepped behind the tapestry, leaving the known world behind. The narrow corridor led them to a massive oak door, bound in blackened bronze. In the center, a keyhole gleamed dimly. Hugo took out the tiny bronze key found behind the visor and inserted it. The key turned with a soft click, as if it had returned home. The door gave way, and what was revealed behind it made them both freeze. A massive circular hall went upward, like a well turned inside out. Shelves of dark wood rose from the floor to the distant dome, and on each crowded thousands of books, scrolls, and manuscripts. The air smelled of dry parchment and something alive, pulsing, as if the hall were breathing. It was the sanctuary of the first architect's mind, where every shelf was a vein through which the blood of untold stories flowed. In the center of the hall stood a massive stone altar. On it lay an open book bound in white leather. The last page broke off mid-word, while the remaining pages stayed blank, waiting. They stepped inside, and Elara realized that the lantern was not needed. The hall glowed on its own. Thousands of books on the shelves radiated a soft, living light. Some smoldered with gold, others shimmered with cool blue, and a third kind cast an emerald green tint. The shelves resembled a stained glass window illuminated from within. The silence here was not dead. From all sides came a continuous, barely perceptible rustling, similar to the whisper of 1,000 voices telling their stories all at once. Elara reached out her hand to the nearest tome. The binding turned out to be warm, and the book shuddered ever so slightly under her fingers, like a sleeping creature sensing a touch. The library was breathing. Each tome was not just a text, but a preserved world, full of restrained energy that strained to get out and was held back only by the leather covers. Elara snatched her hand back and whispered, "They are alive." Hugo nodded silently, and the multicolored reflections of alien, locked universes danced in his eyes. Elara walked along the shelves, barely touching the spines with her fingertips. Every touch echoed with warmth, vibration, sometimes a distant echo of a stranger's voice. She stopped and turned to Hugo. "These are not chronicles," she whispered. "The first architect collected not words on parchment, but events themselves. He preserved the magic of stories. Each book is a portal into a preserved world." But then her palm rested on a tome that pulsed more sharply than the others. The binding was hot, and the rustling inside sounded not like a whisper, but a groan. Elara snatched her hand back. Nearby, she found another such book, and another. Unfinished stories, broken off mid-word, bled magical energy like open wounds. It was they that destabilized the castle, tearing its poetic fabric from the inside. "That is why the staircases are severed," Elara exhaled. One book suffered more than the rest, a massive tome in a darkened leather binding, decorated with silver runes, was almost jumping on the shelf. The runes shimmered dimly, now flaring up, now fading, like a feverish pulse, and from under the cover came a quiet, desperate groan that made the heart clench. Hugo stepped forward and took Elara's hand in warning. She felt his firm, reliable grip, but gently freed herself. There was no fear. There was the instinct of an archivist accustomed to healing wounded books and deep compassion for whatever was suffering behind that binding. Elara reached out her hand. Her fingertips touched the warm, vibrating leather, the way one touches the forehead of a patient with a fever. Under her fingers beat a foreign heart, the pulse of an unfinished world locked in the pages, desperately calling for help. Her fingers touched the binding, and the world fractured. The circular hall of the library shuddered, drifted like a reflection in disturbed water, and dissolved. Elara was caught in a whirlpool of ink and parchment. Letters tore off the pages, swirling around her in a shining tunnel, and each brought with it a shard of an alien reality. A sound, a smell, a touch. First came the smells: thick pine needles, the bitter smoke of campfires, a freezing wind stinging the cheeks. Then the sounds: the distant clashing of swords, the hoarse cries of forest birds, the heavy clatter of hooves on the frozen ground. Words were no longer flat signs on paper. They became space, air, and earth, swallowing her whole. The whirlpool subsided just as suddenly as it had begun. Elara stood on a snow-covered forest road. Fir trees closed in overhead in a dark vault. The neighing of horses came from around the bend, and ahead, by a dying campfire, sat 3 travelers in worn cloaks, characters of an unfinished fairy tale, frozen in wait for the continuation of their story. The scene repeated itself. A young knight in battered armor stood at the fork of 2 roads, shifting his gaze from one path to the other. His face was twisted with the agony of indecision. A step to the left, he would freeze, return, look to the right, and everything started anew. An eternal loop, a severed plot, stuck mid-word. Elara understood instantly. The author had not finished writing the choice. The hero was doomed to eternal doubt. She remembered the fresco in the east wing of the castle, an owl showing a traveler the way through the thicket. She stepped toward the knight and quietly said, "Do not look for hoof prints. Raise your eyes. The owl is already flying over the right path." The knight raised his head. A white owl silently glided over the right road. His face cleared, his shoulders squared. He gave a short bow and stepped forward confidently. The loop broke. Elara did not write a new chapter. She merely added a comma that another's fate lacked to move on. The night disappeared behind the fir trees, and the winter forest shuddered, grew pale, and began to melt like watercolors in the rain. White light poured from everywhere, swallowing the trees, the snow, the sky. Elara surfaced into reality with a sharp inhale, as if emerging from underwater. The circular hall of the secret library stood in place. The shelves, the dome, the shimmering spines. Her palm still lay on the cover. Hugo, pale with worry, held her firmly by the shoulder. "You disappeared," he whispered. "You just dissolved. I called you." Elara looked down at the book. The binding no longer vibrated. the anxious groan faded. The silver runes burned with a steady, calm gold, like the embers of a burnt-out campfire. The story had found its finale. The wound had closed. The ancient tome sighed with relief, falling asleep on the shelf with the dream of a completed fairy tale. Elara smiled, tiredly but happily. Elara leaned against the altar, catching her breath, and raised her shining eyes to Hugo. The castle is not broken, Hugo. It is sick. And it is sick with unfinished stories. She began to speak quickly, passionately, putting the pieces together into a whole. The first architect did not just build walls. He wove the magic of his own fairy tales into the stone. Every floor was a chapter, every corridor a line, every staircase a connecting thread of the plot. Rosenwald stood not on a foundation, but on a narrative. When the architect disappeared, leaving his main work unfinished, the thread broke. The connection between the floors was torn apart, just as a thought breaks off on a blank page. The stone and mortar were merely the body of the building, but its soul was words. The torn steps screamed of a torn narrative. To heal the castle, we must finish writing its story, Elara concluded. They searched the shelves, but the architect's notes were not found among the thousands of tomes. Then Hugo walked over to the stone altar and dropped to his knees. His fingers glided over the base, feeling for familiar seams. A quiet click, and a narrow hidden compartment slid out from the marble pedestal. Inside lay not a magical book, but a simple notebook in a worn leather binding, a diary. Elara took it carefully, the way one takes a wounded bird, and began to turn the fragile pages. The entries became shorter and shorter, the handwriting more and more uneven. The last entry, drawn by a trembling hand, became a bridge across the abyss of time. My main book is not finished. Darkness has taken my strength. I have locked the upper chambers, severing the paths. Only the one who dares to finish writing the finale, taking a step not on stone, but on faith in the story, will be able to cross over the abyss. Elara closed the notebook. Her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from awe. Silence hung between them, heavy as lead. Hugo was the first to break it, and his voice trembled. Is he trying to say that we must step into the abyss? Just believe that the emptiness will hold us? Elara nodded slowly. The steps in the void are a test of faith, Hugo. Faith that a story, if it is right and honest, can become a support stronger than stone. She explained, to finish building the staircase, one must take the main book from the altar, complete the severed narrative in one's heart, and step to where the marble breaks off. Rely not on the laws of gravity, but on the logic of the plot. The architect demanded from them not building skills, but the courage to trust words more than gravity. This is madness, whispered Hugo. It is the only way, Elara answered. The main book waited on the altar. A massive tome bound in white leather pulsed stronger than all the rest. Anxiously, persistently, like a heart before battle. Elara lifted it with both hands. It turned out to be heavy, as if it were not paper enclosed in its pages, but destiny itself. She opened the last written page. The story broke off at the most desperate moment. The kingdom was perishing under an eternal winter, and salvation was so close. But the final words were missing. Further on were empty sheets, white and silent. Elara closed the book and pressed it to her chest, the way a knight presses a shield. The weight of the blank page pressed harder than steel, for now she had to become its author. "We are ready," she said. Hugo nodded silently, and they walked out of the secret library, heading toward the precipice of the grand staircase. Deep night. The third-floor hall was drowning in gloom, and only the solitary lantern in Hugo's hand snatched the edge of the grand staircase from the darkness. The white marble broke off in a smooth, flawless cut. Beyond was nothing, only a black, echoing void going down to the distant floor of the first level, which from here seemed like the bottom of a bottomless well. A cold draft tore at the hems of their clothes, as if invisible hands were pulling them to the edge. Hugo, usually unflappable, grew pale and involuntarily took a step back. His lantern swayed, and shadows darted across the walls. "This is madness, Elara, pure madness." But she was already standing at the very edge, right where the last step stepped into nothingness. The main book was pressed to her chest with both hands. Her heart was pounding so loudly that it seemed its beating could be heard in all the towers of the castle. The abyss breathed with cold and doubt, but an unyielding resolve burned in Elara's eyes. Elara closed her eyes. The wind from the abyss hit her face. Her instinct screamed, "Step back, this is death." But she forced herself not to listen to her body. Only the book, only the story. Behind her closed eyelids, the unfinished world unfolded. She saw a kingdom bound by eternal winter. Dead fields, frozen rivers, people who had lost hope. And then she began to formulate the finale, not with ink, but with her heart. She imagined how the ice cracked, how the first greenery broke through the snow, how gardens bloomed and heroes found peace. She poured into every image all her faith that no good fairy tale breaks off mid-word. If the finale turned out to be insincere, the emptiness would not forgive. She would simply shatter. "The story must be completed," Elara whispered. "And if a bridge is needed for this, I will become it." She took a deep breath and raised her foot over the precipice. Elara's foot came down into the void. Hugo cried out and lunged forward, reaching out a hand to grab her by the shoulder. But he was too late. She did not fall. At the very moment when her soul was meant to slice through the air, A light flared beneath it, bright, golden, warm as a dawn after a long winter. Out of nowhere, right in the air, a step wove itself together. Not marble, not stone. It was made of solid radiance, and inside, like gnats in amber, flowed and intertwined words, letters, whole lines, written not in the architect's ink, but in Elara's own handwriting, the handwriting of her heart. Gravity retreated before the power of storytelling. The emptiness thickened into a glowing support, carved not by a chisel, but by a sincere word. The step was firm as marble and warm as a page that had just left the printing press. Elara stood above the abyss. She stood on her own story, and the abyss held her. Hugo slowly lowered his outstretched hand. His eyes were full of tears. Elara turned around and held out her hand. The smile on her face was calm, like that of a person who has found solid ground after a long voyage. "Come on, Hugo, it will hold." He swallowed, squeezed her hand, and took a step. A step of golden light flared under his foot, and he felt it. Firm, reliable, warm. They began to ascend. With every step, a new step was born ahead. A shining bridge of words thrown across the dark abyss of the hall. Light spilled over the walls, chasing away the centuries-old darkness, waking the sleeping stained glass windows, making the armor in the niches flare with reflected gold. They climbed a staircase that was not on any blueprint, stepping across a bridge of completed fairy tales. Higher, even higher, until before them rose the massive doors of the first architect's forbidden chambers, closed for 300 years. The doors swung open without a creak, as if they had waited for them for 3 centuries and had finally gotten their wish. Elara and Hugo crossed the threshold and froze. There was no dust here. Time in this room did not flow. It had frozen, like a fly in amber. On the massive oak table lay a split pen with a drop of ink on its tip, still wet. Nearby stood parted compasses, a scroll with an unfinished blueprint, and a glass of wine in which the ruby liquid had not had time to go flat in 300 years. The air was thick with the unspoken thoughts of the great creator. In the center of the study rose an ebony pedestal, from which emanated a faint, steady glow. The magical core of the castle. Its control room, its heart, frozen between beats in anticipation of the final chord. Elara whispered, "He left, but he left everything ready. He believed that someone would come." Elara approached the ebony pedestal and carefully lowered the main book onto it. The white binding lay on the dark surface like snow on the ground. She opened the book to the last blank page and placed her palm over it. A pen was not needed. Elara closed her eyes and in a whisper spoke those very words that had been born in her heart on the edge of the precipice. Words about a spring that replaced eternal winter, about gardens that bloomed in the ashes, about heroes who found their way home. Every word was an exhale, every phrase a heartbeat. She placed a period, not an ink one, but an invisible one, woven from absolute certainty that the story was completed correctly. The book flared with a blinding white light, took her thought into itself, and closed its pages. The final breach in the magical foundation of Rosenwald healed over. The period had been placed, and Rosenwald shuddered. All of it, from the foundation to the weather vanes on the towers, like an awakened giant taking its first breath after a 300-year sleep. A pillar of golden light erupted from the closed book. It struck the ceiling, split into thousands of rays, and spread in waves across the walls, across the floor, across every crack in the stone. And then the swarm began. Hundreds of thousands of golden letters and words broke off the pages like glowing bees leaving a hive. They poured out of the study into the corridors, rushed through the halls, soared up the flights of stairs, burst into the towers. Words, freed from the captivity of paper, flowed through the veins of the old castle like golden blood. They flew to where voids and precipices gaped, filling every breach with their healing energy. The castle hummed, vibrated, sang. For the first time in centuries, its stone body was filled to the brim. They ran out onto the inner balcony and froze, gripping the railing. Below, in the massive hall, a miracle was taking place. The severed staircases were coming to life. Where the marble had broken off into nothingness for centuries, out of the air, with an echoing stone ring, new steps were being born. Snow white, shining, they appeared one after another, as if an invisible stonemason were laying them with incredible speed. Each new step connected with the upper tier accurately, flawlessly, like the final piece of a mosaic falling into place. Carved railings wove together following them, growing out of the marble like living vines. The grand staircase fused together first. After it, the side flights to the north tower. Flight after flight, floor after floor, the abysses that had gaped for centuries closed up, returning its lost grandeur to the castle. Marble was born from the air to the music of a fulfilled prophecy. Rosenwald was whole again, all paths restored, all floors connected. The giant woke up and squared its shoulders. They climbed steps that just yesterday had not existed. The stone spiral staircase of the North Tower led them higher and higher, and every step sounded confident, firm. The marble underfoot was real, reliable, warm. The observation deck met them with wind and open space. Far below spread a valley wrapped in pre-dawn fog, and beyond it darkened endless forests. And then the sun appeared over the horizon. The first rays broke through the milky haze, gilding the tops of the fir trees, glided across the walls of the healed castle, ignited the stained glass windows. The sun rose not as a conqueror, but as an old friend who had come to greet a world that had finally found peace. The morning air was fresh and clean, as the first page of a new book. Elara and Hugo stood side by side, shoulder to shoulder, tired and absolutely happy, looking out at the waking world. Elara looked back at the towers, at the walls that had come to life, at the stained glass windows burning in the morning light, and she understood. She was no longer a guest, not a hired archivist who had come for a while. She was a part of this place. Years of wandering through other people's archives, dusty basements, and forgotten libraries had led her here. All this time she had been looking for old books, but she found a new world in which every stone and every page knew her name. Here her mind found a task, her faith found a support, her love for stories found real, living meaning. Rosenwald was not just a castle. It became a home. The first real home, where it was not walls that waited for her, but stories that needed her. Elara turned to Hugo. The morning light softly outlined his face, and she saw he had changed. This was no longer a silent guard of ruins, but the keeper of a living, breathing castle. His shoulders squared, and in his eyes, instead of the usual restrained sadness, shone a calm dignity. Their eyes met, and words turned out to be unnecessary. Everything that needed to be said had already been said that night. On the edge of the precipice, in the handshake over the abyss, in the shared step on the stairs of light. They did not just save Rosenwald, they became its soul. From now and forever, Elara, the keeper of stories, and Hugo, the keeper of mechanisms. Their union, born over the precipice, was stronger than any foundation, fastening together the wisdom of the word and the reliability of stone. Rosenwald Castle to this day stands among the ancient forests. In its fireplaces of fire crackles, in its libraries living books rustle, and upon its staircases, whole, beautiful, leading from the basements to the very highest towers, walk two keepers, guarding every story, every stone, every whisper of the century-old walls. The secrets of Rosenwald no longer frighten. They merely call to new, peaceful discoveries, the way an unopened book on a shelf calls. And if this fairy tale teaches anything, it is this. Even the most terrible emptiness can be overcome. Every unsolved mystery waits for its brave seeker. And any path, even the most hopelessly severed, can be finished if you take a step with faith in your heart and a good story in your soul. Sleep peacefully. The fairy tale is over.